The telephone, television, radio and postal systems are essential communication infrastructures in our world. But at the dawn of the 21st century, it looks like the Internet, begun in 1969 as an experimental computer network, is taking over many of their functions. The Internet can do that because it was built with an open architecture. It's a superhighway with plenty of on-ramps, lanes and no traffic restrictions. It can cope with whatever comes down the road. This generality of purpose is the brilliance of its design.
We were very conscious that we were opening up new territory and that rather than pick very limited applications, that we ought to lay a foundation that was as broad and open-ended as possible.
Anyone could contribute ideas about its use and how to improve it. Ideas were offered as requests for comments, so everyone would feel free to discuss and criticize them.
So we made the simplest possible rules. Anybody could write anything they want, that it had no status, that it got whatever credibility it got from its content, not from the fact that it had been blessed by somebody.
There's a kind of internet culture which grew out of the academic community. What you find is that there's a tradition of sharing of knowledge, that people will add to it. They will find mistakes and bugs and they'll fix them, they'll tell you about them and everybody else. The rate of evolution, the rate at which of new functionality can be added is very higher, much higher, simply because so many people are contributing to it.
By 1972, the ARPANET had fewer than 25 sites online, but more were coming. The first international conference on computers and communication, sponsored by ARPA, was held as a launch party for its network. Robert Metcalfe, fresh from MIT and Harvard, was in charge of compiling a list of just what the network could do.
So all I did was contact all the people who had computers on the ARPANET, and there weren't very many, like 19 or 23 or some number, and said, do you have something interesting that's going on at your host that you'd like other people to access over the net?
Metcalfe could only find a few esoteric uses for the fledgling network. But at this early stage, that was enough for an impressive demonstration.
By the time of this demo, I could find 19, imagine that, 19 different things that you could do on the net. And they had a program that pretended to be a psychotic. They had games that you could play. They had demonstrations of symbolic manipulation of mathematical formulas. They had more technical things like remote job entry for submitting jobs from one computer to the next and getting the results back.
But demonstrations can sometimes go wrong.
Well, imagine a graduate student, big red beard. I put together this book, and in walks 10 AT&T executives, all in pinstripe suits. And they needed someone to give them a tour of the ARPANET, so I was the natural choice, having done the book. So they gave me these 10 executives, and I started giving them the tour. And right in the middle of the tour, the ARPANET, for the only time during the 2 or 3 days of the demonstration, the net crashed, the computer, the IMP, crashed, and the demo froze. And here's this poor graduate student having worked on this for several years and being his life's work, and he turns around, and these 10 AT&T executives thought it was funny. In fact, were somewhat amused and happy that it had crashed, because this was very reassuring to their lifestyle and their technology, that this packet switching was just too unreliable and they didn't have to worry about it. And the fact that they were amused angered me greatly. Angered me. In fact, to this day, many years later, I still have a thing against telephone companies for that reason.
Despite the incident, the conference was a success. Throughout the United States, other computer networks began to emerge. For the National Science Foundation, being on their network was a requisite for receiving their grant money. More networks appeared. LANs, local area networks, which link computers throughout offices. And WANs, wide area networks, which link computers across buildings and campuses. But each new network had its own language. Could disparate networks somehow be interconnected to make an internet? In 1973, Vinton Cerf and Bob Kahn teamed up to develop the TCP/IP protocol, that if followed by different computer networks would allow them to pass their message packets back and forth.
It's protocolon, which actually is the term used to describe a little piece of papyrus that goes on the front of a scroll. But the protocolon is in fact the little thing that tells you what's in the rest of the scroll. We use that term because packets have headers on them at the front that say where they're going, where they came from, and what information they contain, and then comes the information itself. And we thought that represented a protocol too.
The TCP/IP protocol allowed the networks to at last interconnect. Sirpan Khan called the computer in the network that could identify the protocol the gateway.
This puzzle has some pieces already on the board. I had computers of various kinds. I had networks of various kinds. And I wasn't allowed to mess around with the networks. The only place that could know were the outside of the networks. Well, what's outside the networks? The host computers are outside. And then I needed something that would interconnect the networks to each other. And as Bob and I discussed all this, we concluded we needed something that we called a gateway that knew how to talk to each of the networks it was connected to, which could be 2 or 3 or 4, and could encapsulate, envelope, packets coming from the host computers into packets going through the underlying networks.
Other protocols were proposed, but if there wasn't a common one for all networks to follow, a language that they all recognized, there would be several internets instead of a single unified one. Finally, in 1983, after 10 years of refinement and haggling, TCP/IP was adopted as the universal standard, marking a milestone in the development of the internet, a common network of interconnected networks.
If we have enough in common, if we hold enough in common, then we can communicate. If we don't hold enough in common, it's much harder. So in fact, the reason that the network works at all is that we have worked very hard to create all this commonality so that we share enough knowledge to make it possible to convey information to each other.
The ARPANET was developed initially as a tool for defense research and restricted to select universities and think tanks engaged in government projects, not individuals or businesses. As a result, private networks like Prodigy, CompuServe, and America Online appeared, inviting individuals to participate. But the internet had yet to reach the masses. One event was about to change everything, unleashing the full power of free enterprise and ingenuity, and bringing a worldwide communications network into the home and office.